The stones of the agora are already warm. It is still early, the sun not yet fully above the Acropolis, but the light that reaches the city's low places has been gathering in the pale limestone for hours, since before the first merchants arrived with their carts, since before the first arguments started up under the colonnades. The heat in those stones is older than the conversations that will happen above them today. It holds the warmth of 1,000 previous mornings, each one ordinary, each one already gone. A man stands on those stones without sandals. He is not young, and the lack of sandals is not an oversight. He has walked this way for decades, through seasons, through rain that turns the flagstones black, and through summer heat that makes them shimmer. The soles of his feet have mapped the agora the way a craftsman's hands map the surface of a piece of stone. He has been working a long time, with the patient, specific knowledge that accumulates through contact rather than through study. He knows these stones the way he knows the city, slowly and with his whole body. His name is Socrates. He is somewhere in his middle years, perhaps his 40s, and the city around him is at the height of something it will not sustain for long. The Parthenon, on the hill above, has been finished for less than a decade. Its scaffolding is gone, its paint still bright. The columns that later centuries will see as white are now red and gold and blue, the gods across its pediments picked out in colors that the full Athenian sun sets blazing. The building is startling in ways that the imagination, trained on ruins, cannot easily recover. It is enormous. It is loud with color. It stands on its hill like a thought that a civilization has decided to express in stone and pigment and scale, as if proportion itself were a kind of argument, as if the right arrangement of columns could say something about justice that the law courts in the agora below were still working out in words. Pericles had commissioned it. The man who shaped democratic Athens into the city it had become had understood, with the instinct of a gifted leader, that a democracy requires not only institutions, but images, monuments to the ideas it is trying to embody, buildings that make abstract commitments visible and durable. A temple on a hill is an argument made permanent. Stone does not forget its shape. And for the Athenians, the Parthenon was proof that their experiment had worked, that the city's better nature had found a form it could inhabit for centuries. But the Parthenon was also, in some light, a kind of overconfidence. The city that built it had defeated Persia twice. It had gathered the tribute of a maritime empire into its own treasury. It had attracted the best artists, thinkers, and craftsmen of the Greek world into its streets. The 5th century was Athens at its largest idea of itself, and the Parthenon was the material expression of that idea, finished and gleaming above a city that had not yet understood how much it was about to lose. Socrates, barefoot on the agora stones, in the decade after the Parthenon's completion, was practicing a kind of philosophy that Athens was not entirely prepared for, a philosophy that was not interested in monument building, that refused the kind of permanent and confident form the Parthenon exemplified, that insisted, quietly and persistently, that the most important questions had no settled answers at all. The agora in the early morning is never quiet. By the time the light has cleared the Acropolis and begun to reach the lower city at its full angle, the open space at the heart of Athens is already several things at once. There are men selling fish from wooden boards laid across stone benches, the smell of brine and salt air moving under the painted colonnades. There are potters with their wares laid out on cloth, wine merchants with their amphorae stoppered and stacked, farmers from the surrounding countryside who rose before dawn to walk their animals and vegetables into the city, while it was still cool enough to move comfortably. There is the sound of haggling, the sound of livestock, the sound of sandals on stone, and the specific wooden creak of carts being maneuvered between the stalls. It is not a place that has been set aside for thinking. It is a place where the ordinary transactions of urban life are conducted, and where thinking happens anyway, because this is Athens, and because the Athenians have built into their public life the assumption that reasoning belongs to the open air. Around the edges of this commerce, under the covered walkways, and along the borders of the open space, there are also men arguing about justice. Not metaphorically, not in an academic register reserved for the educated. The same space that holds the fish merchants holds the conversations that are trying to work out what the city owes its citizens, what the gods require of their worshippers, what courage actually is when you examine it carefully rather than simply invoking it in wartime. The agora embodies something the Athenians had built into their idea of democracy, the premise that public reasoning is not the private property of those with leisure, rank, or formal education, but belongs to any citizen who stands on the shared stones and opens his mouth. Socrates is in no category this city has a word for. His father, according to the ancient sources that have passed his biography down to later centuries, was a stonemason. There are accounts that suggest Socrates himself worked in stone for a time, that he knew the physical labor of shaping marble and limestone, that he understood in his hands what it meant to find the form inside the material. Whether or not he still carried tools in these middle years of his life, he carried the social position of a working man, not a wealthy citizen, with the leisure that philosophical education typically required in the ancient world, not an aristocrat whose family connections gave his words institutional authority, not a professional teacher who charged fees and maintained a school and occupied the recognized social role of a sophist. He was a stonemason's son who had become, without training, without institutional affiliation, without payment, without any of the formal structures that confer recognition, a philosopher in the truest sense the city had ever produced. He accepted no fees. He maintained no school. He had no fixed curriculum, no lecture hall, no list of enrolled students, no written works that anyone could point to as evidence of his activity. What he had was the agora and the willingness to stop people in it and ask them questions. This was his entire method and his entire institution, and it looked from the outside like nothing the city could quite classify. The young men who gathered around him were drawn from the wealthier families of Athens. There is something worth sitting with in that fact. The stonemason's son, drawing the sons of generals and merchants and political figures into conversations that dismantled the assumptions they had inherited with their wealth. Alcibiades, brilliant and dangerous, and eventually catastrophic for Athens, spent time at Socrates' side. Plato, who would in the next century become the most influential philosopher the Western tradition produced, was a young Athenian aristocrat who found his way to Socrates and stayed. Something about this figure, barefoot, without fees, belonging to no guild or school or class, asking his questions in the middle of the marketplace, drew the young men who had everything toward him with a pull they could not entirely explain and could not easily walk away from. What the established authorities of Athens experienced was different. A politician who has built his reputation on knowing what justice requires does not generally welcome a conversation that reveals through careful and patient questioning that he cannot define justice in any way that holds together under scrutiny. A poet who has been celebrated for his wisdom does not find it comfortable to discover, in conversation with a barefoot man who claims to know nothing, that the wisdom attributed to him is largely a reputation built on the enthusiasm of audiences who were moved rather than informed. A general who has spent a career making courageous decisions does not necessarily enjoy being asked to define courage and finding that every definition he produces can be dismantled by a single well-chosen counterexample. The questioning was not malicious. The man doing the questioning genuinely seemed to find the process interesting rather than adversarial, but the effect on the people questioned was often indistinguishable from humiliation, and the effect on the city's established hierarchy of knowledge was the same whether Socrates intended it or not. Knowledge in Athens was bound up with rank. The assumption was not always stated openly, but it ran through the city's social fabric in the way that many assumptions run through a culture, too deeply embedded to require articulation, too widely shared to require defense. The man who had held high office knew what justice required because he had spent his life administering it. The poet who had been celebrated by the city knew what beauty was because the city had found his work beautiful. The craftsman who had mastered his trade knew by virtue of that mastery what excellence looked like in the domain he had spent his life working in. Knowledge was tied to demonstrated social achievement, and social achievement was tied, in ways that the Athenian democratic ideal made complicated but did not dissolve, to family, wealth, and the particular kind of authority that comes with having been publicly recognized by one's peers. Socrates walked into this arrangement and asked questions. He asked them without rank, without fees, without a school, without the institutional scaffolding that would have made his questioning a recognized and therefore tolerable feature of the city's intellectual life. He asked them in public, in the agora, where anyone could watch the politician or the poet or the general fail to define the very thing he had spent his career embodying. And the questions were not hostile, which in some ways made them worse. A hostile questioner can be dismissed as an enemy, for he's a man who is genuinely puzzled, who seems sincerely to hope that the person he is speaking to will illuminate something he has been unable to work out on his own, and who expresses only honest confusion when the illumination fails to arrive. Such a man is much harder to dismiss, and the damage his questions do to a reputation is much harder to defend against. The city watched all of this for decades. It watched through the building of the Parthenon and the years of Periclean confidence, through the beginning of the long Peloponnesian War with Sparta, through the plague that killed Pericles and tens of thousands of Athenians in the years that followed, through 27 years of intermittent war that drained the city of its treasury, its young men, and its certainty about its own future. Socrates was in his late 30s when the war began. He served as a soldier, acquitting himself by all accounts, with the kind of unshowy physical courage that his philosophy suggested he would, steady under pressure, indifferent to hardship, more interested in maintaining his own internal consistency than in managing how he appeared to the people around him. He was somewhere in his 60s when the war finally ended in Athenian defeat, the city's empire dissolved, its fleet destroyed, its walls torn down on Spartan orders, while Spartan musicians played flutes to mark the end of what had once seemed permanent. The 30 tyrants came after the defeat. Spartan imposed them on Athens as the condition of peace. 30 oligarchs who ruled the city for less than a year, but who conducted that rule with a violence that left permanent marks on Athenian memory. They executed their opponents. They seized property. They used the terror of sudden arbitrary death to consolidate a power that had no legitimacy except Spartan force. In 9 months, they killed somewhere between 1,500 and 1,550 Athenian citizens. in a city whose total citizen population may have been around 30,000, a percentage that concentrated grief and fear into every street and household. The Democratic faction eventually expelled them, and democracy was restored, but the restoration arrived in a city that had been traumatized by defeat and by the experience of its own citizens turning on one another with methodical brutality. It was in this city, wounded, self-suspicious, trying to recover a sense of stable civic identity in the wreckage of military defeat and internal violence, that Socrates stood trial in 399 BCE. He was 70 years old. The formal charges were impiety and corruption of the youth. Impiety toward the gods of the city he had walked through barefoot for 70 years. Corruption of the young men who had gathered around him in the agora and who had in some cases gone on to cause enormous harm to Athens. Alcibiades had eventually defected to Sparta and been instrumental in the city's defeat. Critne, who had also moved in philosophical circles as a young man, became the most brutal of the 30 tyrants. Whether the connection was causal, whether Socrates' questioning had produced the men who damaged Athens, was a question the city had been building toward for decades, and the trial was the form its answer took. The jury that sat in judgment was not a small panel of specialists. The Athenian legal system assembled large citizen juries for significant cases, and for the trial of Socrates the number was 500. 500 ordinary Athenians, drawn by lot from the citizen population of a city that had been through everything the previous 3 decades had brought. They were farmers and merchants and craftsmen and former soldiers, men who had lost relatives in the plague and in the war, men who had watched the 30 tyrants kill their neighbors, men trying to rebuild a sense of what Athens was and what it stood for, and what kinds of behavior it could and could not tolerate in its streets. Socrates spoke in his own defense. He did not bring his wife and children before the jury to move the members with the spectacle of familial grief, as was customary. He did not beg. He did not moderate the strangeness of his position in order to seem less threatening to men who were already deciding whether he was dangerous. The speech Plato preserves in the Apology is not a speech designed to secure an acquittal. It is a speech designed to tell the truth as the man giving it understood it, which was not the same thing at all, and Socrates seems to have known the difference and chosen truth anyway. The jury voted to convict, 280 votes to 220. The margin was not enormous. In another city, in a different year, on a different day, those 20 votes might have gone the other way. After the verdict, the Athenian process required both parties to propose penalties. The prosecution proposed death. Socrates proposed something that the jury apparently found more insulting than the charge itself. He suggested, at least in Plato's account, that his punishment might be free meals at public expense, the honor the city traditionally offered its greatest benefactors, before arriving at a more practical offer of a fine. The jury reconsidered and voted for death by a larger margin than had voted for conviction. The execution was delayed. Athenian custom prohibited executions during a sacred period when the city's ceremonial ship was absent on a religious mission to the island of Delos. The ship was away for 30 days, and for 30 days Socrates waited in the prison that stood at the edge of the agora he had walked for decades. His friends came to visit. Plato, who was present for the trial, says that he was ill on the last day and did not witness the death. Crito, an old friend, came early on what would be the final morning and told Socrates the ship had been sighted. The conversation that followed was, by any account, calm. The sequence of all this, the trial, the conviction, the execution of a man who had spent his life asking questions in the marketplace, is one of the most examined events in the long history of Western thought. But sitting with the event itself at the distance of 24 centuries, what is most striking is not the tragedy of it, which has been rehearsed sufficiently, but something else, something about the scale of the machinery and the ordinariness of the people inside it. 500 men. They came from the ordinary life of a city recovering from war and tyranny and plague. They sat in their assigned places and heard a 70-year-old man defend himself, in his own particular way, for charges that were bound up with everything the city was most frightened of in itself. The question of what it owed its gods, the question of whether it had failed its young men, the question of whether 30 years of catastrophe were connected to 30 years of a man asking destabilizing questions in the public square. They voted with small tokens, the way the democratic system required. The tokens were counted, the result was announced, and then 500 people walked back out into the streets of Athens. They went back to their market stalls and their households and their fields outside the city walls. The sun continued its arc. The agora continued its morning commerce. The Parthenon continued to stand on its hill above the city, its colors perhaps beginning, by that year, to show the first fading that time inflicts on everything that tries to fix itself in permanent form. The ordinary city absorbed the event, the way ordinary cities absorb enormous events, slowly, incompletely, while continuing to be itself. The stones of the agora, worn smooth by decades of feet, by the bare feet of one particular philosopher, and the sandaled feet of the 500 who sat in judgment of him, and the millions of ordinary feet that passed through in all the decades before and after, held the heat of another afternoon. What passed through that city on that day? The ideas that had been questioned, the certainty that had been taken apart and examined and put back together in forms that never quite reassembled into their original shapes, did not stay in Athens. It moved out through time the way heat moves through stone, slowly in all directions, warming everything it reaches with the residue of a conversation that was, when it happened, taking place on an otherwise ordinary street corner in a city that was trying, with considerable urgency and considerable difficulty, to understand what it believed. 500 people dispersed into their lives. A man was convicted. A city went on being a city, and the questions that had been asked in its marketplace, patient, persistent, genuinely curious, genuinely without settled answers, began their long movement through the centuries ahead, still asking, still open, still passing through the stones of everywhere they landed, like warmth that has no particular destination and nowhere that it needs to go. The afternoon light on the Parthenon in those years was very bright. The columns caught it and held it in the way that marble holds everything it is given, not displaying it exactly, but becoming briefly luminous with it, the color and proportion of the building suddenly more visible in the full force of the Athenian sun than they were at any other hour. Below on the hill, the city went about its business. The merchants and the philosophers shared their flagstones. The smell of livestock drifted under the colonnades. Somewhere in the agora, perhaps, a wealthy young man had stopped mid-stride, caught by a question he had not expected, unable to answer it, finding, to his own surprise, that he was unable to walk away from it either. The question was not hostile. It was patient. It waited with the unhurried quality of something that had all the time in the world, because questions, unlike the men who ask them, were not subject to the particular kind of ending that a jury of 500 ordinary citizens can bring about with their small tokens on an otherwise ordinary afternoon in a wounded city trying to understand itself. The stones were warm. The day was continuing. The questions were already loose in the air, moving in ways that neither the man who asked them nor the city that condemned him had the means to trace or to contain. In the streets outside the court, on the day of the verdict, 500 ordinary people walked back into their ordinary lives, each one carrying, whether or not they knew it, some residue of what had happened, some slight disturbance in the air that comes when an enormous idea passes through the most familiar and unremarkable of human moments, like the warmth that remains in stone long after the sun that heated it has set, long after the day itself has become another day, indistinguishable in the record of ordinary time from the thousands of days that preceded it and the thousands of days that would follow, each one holding its warmth, each one slowly, almost imperceptibly, cooling into night. Cherepha was not a calm man by nature. His friends knew this about him, knew the way he moved through the agora with a kind of restless forward energy, the way he laughed too quickly, asked questions that felt more like interruptions than inquiries. So when he came back from Delphi, his friends expected the usual Cherephan, quick-limbed, a little breathless, already talking before he arrived. What they found instead was someone who had been made careful, someone who had come a long distance, carrying something he wasn't sure how to set down. He found Socrates in the afternoon. The light at that hour in Athens came from a low angle, catching the dust that moved through the colonnades in slow turns, giving the whole agora a quality of bronze and patience. Socrates was standing, as he often stood, not quite among the merchants, and not quite apart from them, that characteristic posture of his, neither arriving nor departing, occupying the particular kind of stillness that belongs to a man who has nowhere to be because he has decided that here, wherever he is standing, is already exactly the right place. Cherephan told him what the oracle had said. He reported it carefully because he had been careful with it all the way from Delphi, carrying it the way one carries something fragile across uneven ground. The oracle at Delphi, the woman seated in the stone chamber above the fissure in the earth, in the air thick with laurel smoke, whose pronouncements came wrapped in ambiguity, but whose authority was as close to absolute as the ancient Greek world permitted, had been asked whether anyone was wiser than Socrates, and she had said no. She had said that no one was wiser. Socrates stood with this for a moment. The afternoon moved around them. A merchant called out from somewhere near the grain stalls. A cart moved slowly past with its wheels on the old stone, and the sound of it was the sound of that city going about its usual business without any particular awareness that something had just happened. Cherephan watched his friend receive the oracle's verdict, and what he saw was not pride, and not pleasure, and not the slow, dignified nod of a man who has been confirmed in what he already believed. What he saw looked more like a man who has just been handed a problem. This is the detail about Socrates that sits at the center of everything. Given the highest possible endorsement, his first response was doubt, not false modesty, not the ritual deflection of a man performing humility for an audience, something more honest than that, a genuine perplexity, because Socrates knew what he knew, and what he knew was not much, and if the oracle of Delphi had just declared that no one alive was wiser than this, then something in that statement required examination. Either the oracle was wrong, which was difficult to argue, or the statement meant something other than what it appeared to mean, and Socrates, being Socrates, chose to find out. What he set out to do, in the months and years that followed, was to disprove it. He went looking for someone wiser than himself. This was not a philosophical exercise or a rhetorical display. It was genuine. He understood the oracle's declaration as a puzzle that had been placed in front of him, and his solution was to go and find the wiser person the oracle had apparently overlooked, bring this finding back to the evidence, and demonstrate that the declaration required revision. He began where any reasonable person in 5th century Athens would begin, with the people who were widely regarded as wise, the politicians, the poets, the craftsmen, the men whose reputation for knowledge and judgment was established, acknowledged, and arrived at over years of demonstrated competence. He went to a celebrated Athenian politician first. He went full of genuine hope, which is one of the details about this investigation that tends to get lost in the retelling. He was not going to catch anyone out. He was not going in armed with questions designed to embarrass. He was going because he actually believed that here, in this man of affairs and authority, he might find the wiser person he was looking for. He was going to listen. What he found was harder to account for. The politician knew things. This was not in question. He knew the city's business, its alliances and grievances, the practical mechanisms of democratic governance, the names and histories of the people whose interests he managed. He spoke with fluency and confidence, and his confidence was not entirely without foundation. But Socrates, sitting across from him and listening carefully, began to notice something. When the conversation moved from political specifics toward the principles behind them, when the question shifted from what to do to why, from the decision to the value it was grounded in, the politician's knowledge underwent a change in quality. It did not stop. It continued at the same pace, in the same register of certainty, but it was no longer doing the same work. What had been, 5 minutes earlier, the genuine competence of an experienced administrator was now something else. The sound of expertise extending beyond its own territory while remaining entirely unconscious of having done so. The politician believed, completely and without examination, that because he knew Athens, he knew justice. Because he could manage a city, he understood what a city was for. Because he had handled the practical realities of power for many years, he had earned the right to speak about what power ought to be. Socrates sat with this for a while, asking his careful questions, and when he left, an hour or two later, stepping back into the afternoon light of the city, he left having understood something that he wished, in a way he had not understood. The politician was not wise. He had mistaken the accumulated competence of his particular work for wisdom, and the mistake was so complete, so continuous with everything he believed about himself, that there was no space inside it for doubt to enter. And here's the part that settled on Socrates like a weight on the walk home. Socrates understood that he himself did not make this mistake, not because he was smarter, not because his arguments were better, but because he knew that he did not know. He knew, specifically and clearly, where his own understanding ran out. He could feel the edge of it, and the politician, for all his genuine competence, could not feel his edge at all, which meant that his authority was larger in his own estimation than any experience he had actually had. So the oracle might have been right, but not in the way the oracle's declaration appeared to mean. He went next to the poets. If anything, Socrates arrived at this visit with more genuine curiosity than the last. The poets occupied a particular position in Athenian life, not merely entertainers, but something closer to interpreters of divine truth, men who spoke in verses that had been moving through Greek culture for centuries, whose language carried the weight of everything the culture knew about beauty and suffering and the will of the gods. If anyone in Athens was in possession of genuine wisdom, it might be these men who had devoted their whole lives to the project of saying what was true in the most exact and beautiful form language could achieve. What he found was more puzzling than the politician had been, in a way that stayed with him longer, The poets could recite. They could perform with extraordinary precision and power the verses that had made their reputations. They could explain what the words meant in the ordinary sense of paraphrase, could walk through the argument of a poem the way a craftsman might walk through the steps of a process. But when Socrates asked them what the poems meant in a deeper sense, what understanding of the good or the beautiful or the true was encoded in the work they had spent their lives producing, the conversation developed a strange quality. They could not quite answer, or rather, they could answer and continued to answer at length with eloquence. But the answers kept being about the poems rather than about the things the poems were supposed to illuminate, as if a window had been mistaken for the view it framed. And when Socrates pressed them gently on this, asked about the principles rather than the examples, the understanding rather than the expression, they became, not unreasonably, a little irritated. They were poets. They had made things of genuine and lasting beauty. And here was this barefoot man with his patient questions suggesting, in the most courteous possible manner, that producing beautiful things and understanding what makes things beautiful might not be the same kind of knowing. He was not wrong, but he did not enjoy being right about this. The craftsmen were different again, and in their case, the visit had an outcome that was almost the reverse. A craftsman in the agora, explaining his trade, was someone in the presence of genuine knowledge. Socrates recognized it immediately, with what read in the ancient accounts as something close to relief. Here was a man who knew something real. Not symbolic, not rhetorical, but actual. The properties of materials, the tolerances of a given joint, the behavior of bronze under particular temperatures. The craftsman's knowledge was tested daily against the resistance of the physical world, and the world pushed back when the knowledge was wrong, which meant the craftsman had developed something the politician and the poet largely lacked, an ongoing practical relationship with the places where his understanding failed. He had been corrected by materials, by fire, by the specific weight and grain of things that did not care what he believed. But then, and Socrates had begun to feel by this point that he knew how this would go, the craftsman's expertise began to expand. From the specific, tested, verified knowledge of his craft, he extended his authority into judgments about justice and beauty and governance and the nature of the good. Not slowly, not with any visible awareness that he was crossing a threshold. The expansion was seamless, as it had been with the politician, as it had been with the poets. The same confidence that had been entirely appropriate when discussing the work itself was now doing something entirely different, underwriting conclusions that no amount of skill with materials had actually earned. There is a word in the Greek philosophical tradition for the condition that Socrates was finding everywhere he looked. It would be set down with precision later, but the experience of it was already visible in every conversation he was having. It is the condition of believing one knows more than one does, not because of dishonesty, not because of vanity, but because certainty in one domain shades invisibly into certainty in adjacent domains, and the boundary between them is genuinely difficult to feel from the inside. The politician was not a fraud. The poets were not pretending. The craftsmen were not lying. They had each simply failed to examine the relationship between what they actually knew and what they believed they knew, and in that unexamined space, false certainty had grown, the way things grow in dark places, without friction, without resistance, without anyone noticing. Socrates came back to Chaerephon's report from Delphi with a different understanding of it than he had set out with. The oracle had said that no one was wiser than Socrates. He had tested this carefully over a long period in many conversations with people whose claim to wisdom was widely acknowledged. And what he had found was not that he was wiser. He continued, throughout all of these investigations, to know very little about the large questions that interested him, had arrived at no settled understanding of what courage was, or justice, or beauty, or the good. He knew no more about these things in any positive sense than when he had started. The advantage he seemed to have, the thing that distinguished his not knowing from everyone else's, was something much smaller and much stranger. He did not believe he knew what he did not know. He had not mistaken the edge of his understanding for the edge of what there was to understand. This is the philosophical nucleus of the Socratic paradox, and it is worth sitting with because it is easy to misread. It can sound like a very clever way of claiming superiority while appearing modest. A man who says he knows nothing while demonstrating, through a long series of conversations, that everyone else knows even less. This looks, on the surface, like a performance, but the paradox survives scrutiny because it contains a genuine and precise distinction. There are two different kinds of knowing operating in this story, and they are not the same. The first is the ordinary kind, knowing that something is the case, knowing how things work, knowing what the right answer is. The second is something different, something that requires a specific kind of attention to acquire, and it does not arrive automatically with the first kind. It is the knowledge of the limits of one's own understanding, not the limits of knowledge in the abstract, but the specific personal awareness of where one's own grasp on things runs out, where the confidence is warranted and where it is merely habitual. Socrates claimed the second kind while acknowledging the absence of the first, and this was not a trick. It was a genuine and specific achievement, arrived at through exactly the kind of careful, honest, relentless self-examination that the oracle at Delphi had been endorsing for centuries in 3 words carved into the stone of the temple entrance. Gnauthi seauton, know thyself. 2,500 years later, the phrase has been handled so often it has worn smooth, but in 5th century Athens it carried the weight of religious injunction. To know oneself was not a therapeutic project or a matter of understanding one's own feelings and preferences. It was the supreme intellectual and religious aspiration of the Greek world. It was what the divine asked of human beings, and Socrates had taken it with a seriousness that most people in Athens found, at best impressive, and at worst deeply unsettling. Because what self-knowledge meant, when examined carefully enough, was not flattering. It did not mean discovering that one was, at heart, a good and worthy person whose values had been sound all along. It meant looking honestly at the structure of what one believed, testing that structure against rigorous questioning, and finding, in nearly every case, that the foundations were less secure than the surface suggested. It meant finding that confidence in most cases outran justification. It meant finding that the beliefs one held most securely about what was just, what was good, what was worth wanting, were most often the beliefs one had examined least. Comfort and certainty tended to go together, which meant that the examination of certainty was almost always, also, in some degree, an experience of discomfort. Socrates did not find this discouraging. There is something in the ancient accounts, in the Platonic dialogues, in the passages of Xenophon that describe his daily manner, of a man who genuinely and consistently found the process of honest examination more interesting than the certainty it displaced. Not interesting in a stimulating or exciting way, interesting in the way that a stone held to the light and turned slowly is interesting, patiently, carefully, without particular urgency, attending to what is actually there, rather than to what one expected to find. His ignorance was not a wound, it was a subject. He held it with something closer to the careful attention of a craftsman examining materials than to the performance of modesty, and this quality of attention, honest, steady, without drama, was perhaps the thing about him that no one could entirely dismiss, however much they found his questions inconvenient. The contrast with the sophists was not lost on the Athenians, who had occasion to observe both. The sophists, and among them the names that survive most clearly in the tradition, are Protagoras, Gorgias, and Thrasymachus, were professionals in the most literal sense. They traveled between cities, offered their services for substantial fees, and promised something specific in return: the ability to argue effectively, to construct a persuasive case, to speak in public with enough skill and authority to win the arguments one needed to win. In a democracy like Athens, where civic life required citizens to speak and persuade and hold their own in public debate, this was not a trivial service. The sophists were answering a genuine need, and the best of them were genuinely skilled at what they offered. But what they were offering, in Socrates' understanding of the matter, was not wisdom. It was not that Protagoras was dishonest, or that Gorgias lacked intelligence. Protagoras, in particular, was someone Socrates seems to have found genuinely interesting, a man whose position that each person is the measure of all things, that truth is relative to the perceiver, was worth taking seriously, precisely because it was carefully argued and difficult to dismiss on the surface. The problem was elsewhere. It was in the relationship between the thing being sold and the thing being claimed. A sophist sold skill. He offered the ability to argue on either side of a question, to make the weaker argument appear the stronger, to perform knowledge persuasively enough that an audience could not detect its absence. This was a technical capacity, and like all technical capacities, it could be learned, practiced, and transferred through instruction. Wisdom, Socrates kept returning to, was something different, not more complicated, necessarily, not requiring a higher order of intelligence, but structurally different in a way that made it impossible to sell, because wisdom, in the sense he was reaching for, was not separable from the moral character of the person who held it. It was not a skill that could be acquired and then applied by anyone, regardless of how they lived or what they valued. The poet who could produce beautiful verses while having no real understanding of beauty had separated in practice the technical from the moral. The sophist who could argue any side of a question had made the separation complete. The argument was a tool. Truth was whatever position happened to need defending today, and the person deploying the tool stood behind it without being answerable to it. What Socrates could not do was teach wisdom for a fee, not because he was principled about money, not because he was performing poverty as a philosophical statement, but because the thing he was practicing, and he described it as a practice rather than a possession, which was itself a meaningful distinction, could not be broken off from the person practicing it and handed over. It was not a technique. It was a relationship with one's own understanding, a habit of testing and returning and setting down and returning again. And it developed, if it developed, through exactly the kind of sustained personal inquiry that no teacher could substitute for. He could question. He could create the conditions under which someone else might begin to question. But the movement from comfortable certainty toward honest unknowing had to be made by the person making it, and it could not be made for them, and no fee made sense for a service that could not be performed on someone else's behalf. This is why Socrates remained, until the end, without a school, without fees, and without disciples in the formal sense. Though Athens was full of young men who followed him through the agora and watched his conversations with the particular quality of attention that belongs to people witnessing something they cannot quite classify, He arranged his own ignorance, held it up to examination the way a craftsman holds a material to the light, with the careful attention of someone who has found something worth looking at and is not in any hurry to put it down. It was not a posture of defeat, it was not resignation. In the ancient accounts, the Socratic acknowledgement of ignorance has a quality of almost intellectual pleasure, not the pleasure of having found an answer, but the pleasure of having found the right question, the honest location where the thinking actually lives, the specific place where what he knew ended and something unresolved and genuinely interesting began. The craftsman who knows the properties of bronze and marble, who has spent years learning through failure what materials will and will not bear. The craftsman knows where the stone cracks. He does not pretend the crack is not there. He works with his attention toward the crack because the crack is the truth of the material, and pretending otherwise produces only broken things. What Socrates had done through years of careful conversation with politicians and poets and craftsmen and young men and generals and priests was find the crack in the material of his own understanding, and to this finding he had brought not shame, but the professional attention of someone who has realized, after a long time working, that the interesting work begins exactly where the material shows you its limits. There is a word inscribed at Delphi, carved into the stone of the temple entrance, above the most authoritative voice in the ancient Greek world, in letters that every visitor to the sanctuary would pass beneath before approaching the oracle. Gnothes seoton, know thyself. The oracle had declared that no one was wiser than Socrates, and what Socrates seems to have understood, after the long investigation that followed, is that the oracle and the inscription were saying the same thing, that the act of knowing oneself, honestly, without flattery, without the comfortable self-deceptions that most people maintain without even being aware of them, was itself the condition that constituted wisdom, not a step on the way to it. That to genuinely know the shape and limits of one's own understanding was not a preparation for wisdom, but its fullest available form. A celebrated sophist, somewhere in Athens, was at that same hour arranging his lecture notes on a fine table in a wealthy household, preparing to teach virtue for a price that reflected the value of what he was selling. The young men who would attend were the sons of prominent families, men who needed to be effective in public life, who understood that speech was power and were willing to pay to acquire it. The sophist was intelligent. The material he was preparing was not without value. The day ahead would be productive in the sense that things would be transmitted and received and understood, and the young men would leave with more than they had when they arrived. And somewhere in the agora, a barefoot man was already standing in the afternoon light, knowing very little, knowing precisely how little, finding in that specific and honest not knowing something he had come to regard as the most reliable thing about himself, not a performance of modesty, not a tactical pose, but the quiet, steady result of having looked at himself long enough and carefully enough that he could no longer pretend the examination had gone well. He had come to think of this as his one advantage, not over anyone in particular, not against the sophists or the politicians or the poets or the craftsmen, none of whom he regarded with contempt, but as an advantage over the condition of comfortable certainty that was, in his observation, the primary obstacle to any genuine thinking about anything that mattered. Comfortable certainty closes the thinking down. It tells the mind that the work is done, that the territory has been mapped, that what remains is only the application of what is already known. And what Socrates had found, through years of conversation and examination, and the patient dismantling of his own confident positions was that the territory was never mapped, that the work was never done, that the most important questions about what was good and just and worth wanting and worth living for remained genuinely open in ways that no amount of confident assertion could close. His small advantage was simply this: he had not mistaken the edge of what he knew for the edge of what was knowable. He had stood at the edge of his own understanding and looked out, and what he found there was not the end of the landscape, but the end of his own map of it, and he had been careful for many years not to confuse the two. That careful distinction, held quietly, without drama, without the need to announce it or teach it or charge for it, was the thing the oracle had named. Not a store of answers, not a catalog of philosophical positions, not a theory of the good, or a method of governance, or a theology. Just this: the honest, patient acknowledgement of where his knowing ended, held with the same attention one brings to anything genuinely worth looking at. Outside in the agora, the afternoon moved into evening. Merchants packed away their goods. The great civic life of the city wound down toward the cooler hours in which people went home to their families and their dinners and their ordinary concerns. The dust settled in the colonnades, the flagstones cooled, and the large questions about what was just, what was good, what was worth knowing remained exactly where they had been in the morning, open and patient, and waiting for tomorrow, not requiring a resolution tonight, not diminished by having been left unresolved, held in the same still quality of attention that Socrates had spent a lifetime learning to bring to them. He does not claim to know what justice is. He does not claim to know what virtue is, or what the gods want, or what constitutes the best human life. What he knows, and what no one else in Athens quite knows in the same way, is that he does not know these things, and that this honest not knowing, clearly seen and steadily held, is not the absence of wisdom, but its most truthful address. The edge of what he knows is not the edge of what there is to know, and in the space between those two edges, quiet and open and larger than any argument, the real thinking lives. Outside the King Archon's court, in the early morning, two men were standing on a threshold. The stone beneath their feet was the same stone that ran through the whole of Athens, worn by centuries of feet, into a low polish that caught the light when the sun was low. It was still low now. The air carried the particular cool of an Athenian morning before the city had fully committed itself to the day, before the noise of the agora had thickened into its midday weight, before the business of the courts had absorbed everyone who had arrived with business to attend to. Euthyphro had arrived with business. Socrates had arrived with business of his own, of a more serious kind, though he was not in any visible hurry to attend to it. Both men were standing in the way that two people stop when a conversation has interrupted their movement at a point between the street and the entrance to the court. Euthyphro was a professional religious expert, a man of considerable standing among those who considered themselves to understand the will of the gods. He carried his expertise like a piece of furniture, a solid, visible thing placed conspicuously in the room, and Socrates, who had just been informed that he was facing charges that would require him to appear before a jury of 500 citizens, had paused on the threshold not because he lacked the intention to move, but because a question had arrived in him, the way questions always arrived in him, the way questions always arrived in him, and the question could not simply be walked past. The question was not a hostile one. It did not have the quality of a trap being set or a test being administered. It had the quality of genuine curiosity, of a man who has encountered something he does not understand and finds, in that not understanding, the beginning of an inquiry he would rather conduct in company than alone. Euthyphro had come to prosecute his own father for the death of a servant. Socrates found this remarkable, not because prosecuting one's father was unusual in itself, though it was, but because it would require a man to be very certain about piety, about what the gods require, about what constitutes impiety and its opposite, before bringing such a charge. And Euthyphro was certain. On this point, he had no doubts at all. Socrates expressed admiration for this certainty. He expressed it warmly, without irony, that Euthyphro could have detected, in a tone that contained genuine interest in what a man so certain might be prepared to say. Would Euthyphro be willing, before they both attended to their respective legal difficulties, to share what he knew about piety? Socrates himself had been charged with impiety, and here was a man who understood piety professionally. The timing was fortunate. The conversation could only help. Euthyphro was pleased to oblige. What followed, over the space of a few minutes on that threshold, in the cool of an Athenian morning, with the sounds of the city assembling itself behind them, was not a debate. It did not have the shape of an argument in which one man defeats another. It had the shape of a question discovering the extent of its own difficulty, a question being handed from person to person and found, each time, too large for the hands holding it. Euthyphro offered his first answer with confidence. Piety, he said, was what he himself was doing now, prosecuting someone who had committed a wrong, even when that someone was a family member. Socrates listened carefully and then observed, with continued warmth, that this was an example of piety rather than a definition of it. What he needed was a description of the quality itself, the thing that all pious actions share, so that he could recognize it wherever it appeared. Something more general. Euthyphro tried again. There is a word for this form of philosophical encounter, for this particular movement from a confident first answer through the difficulties that begin to accumulate against it. The word is the Greek asterisk elenchus, asterisk, which carries the sense of cross-examination, of testing a claim by applying pressure to it from multiple directions until the claim either holds or yields. But the word, as Socrates practiced the thing it names, can mislead. Cross-examination suggests contest. Pressure suggests force. The elenchus, as Socrates conducted it, had neither of these qualities. It had the quality of patience. The question was not pressed toward Euthyphro like something being demanded of him. It was held between the two men, turned slowly, considered from one angle and then another, the way a craftsman might turn an unfamiliar piece of stone in his hands without yet knowing what it is or what it is for. Euthyphro provided a second answer. Socrates received it with the same careful attention he had given the first. Piety, Euthyphro now proposed, was what is dear to the gods. This was more general. This had the shape of a definition. And Socrates, still warm, still interested, still entirely without the satisfaction of a man who has located the weak point in an opponent's position, introduced a difficulty. The Greek gods, as every Athenian knew, did not agree with each other. They disputed and quarreled, as human beings dispute and quarrel, over exactly the kinds of things, justice, honor, beauty, about which piety and impiety would concern itself. If the gods disagreed, then any given action might be dear to some gods and hateful to others. Was it pious or impious? Both simultaneously, by Euthyphro's definition. This did not seem right. Euthyphro agreed that it did not seem right. He revised. What is dear to all the gods, he proposed. What all the gods love without exception, that is pious. And what all the gods hate, that is impious. Now there were no disagreements among the divine to complicate matters. But this revision, which Euthyphro offered with renewed confidence, brought the question to the moment at which it has been standing, unmoved, for 24 centuries. Socrates asked a question. He asked it slowly, as though working out the shape of it as he spoke. When the gods love something, is it dear to them because it is pious? Or is it pious because they love it? The question hung in the air between the two men, like a question that had found its perfect form, not sharp, not combative, patient in the way that something permanent tends to be patient, in the way a particular arrangement of stone tends simply to remain what it is, regardless of who is looking at it, or for how long. Euthyphro struggled with it, in the way that a genuinely careful person struggles with something that at first seems manageable and then reveals itself to be much more than that, because the question pressed on something real. If the gods love pious things because those things are already pious, then piety has a nature that exists independently of the gods, and the gods' love of it is a response to that nature rather than a source of it, which means the gods themselves are not the ultimate authority on what piety is. But if pious things are pious simply because the gods love them, then piety is a consequence of divine preference, and the question of why the gods prefer what they prefer becomes the real question, a question that cannot be answered by appeal to the gods without moving in a circle. The definition, either way, fails to do what a definition needs to do. It either introduces a prior concept of holiness that it does not explain, or it explains holiness as arbitrary preference, which is not explanation at all. Euthyphro was a professional. He recovered. He offered further answers, following the conversation as it moved through territories he had not expected to enter when he arrived at the court that morning. Each answer received the same careful attention. Each was explored until the difficulty in it became visible, not because the difficulty had been placed there by Socrates, but because the difficulty was already there, had always been there, had been present in the concept long before Euthyphro or anyone had tried to examine it closely. And eventually, with the sounds of the city growing louder behind them and the day pressing forward with its various demands, Euthyphro remembered he had business to attend to. He excused himself. He left. The conversation ended, not with a conclusion, but with a position, with both men standing, or one standing, one having moved away, at the edge of a question that had not been answered. What Socrates was left with, and what the dialogue preserves, is a state that Greek philosophy had a name for, asterisk, aporia, asterisk. The word carries several meanings, all of which touch on the same experience, a lack of passage, an impasse, a condition of genuine philosophical difficulty in which the paths one expected to travel have closed, and the destination one expected to reach is not there, and the mind finds itself in a territory that does not have the familiar markers by which one ordinarily navigates. It is easy to describe this as failure. Euthyphro had arrived at the court knowing what piety was, and he was leaving the threshold not knowing what piety was, which seems by any ordinary measure like a diminishment. He knew less, in some sense, than he had when the morning began. But Socrates did not experience aporia as failure. This is one of the quieter, more important things about his philosophical practice, the thing that takes the longest to feel correctly. The state of genuine uncertainty that the elenchus produced was not, for him, the evidence that the inquiry had broken down. It was evidence that something essential had been removed, something that had been blocking the view. Euthyphro, before the conversation, had been standing in front of a question and believing he had already answered it. The answer had the shape of knowledge without its substance. It had the weight and posture of understanding without the understanding itself. And because the false answer was occupying the space where genuine investigation could have been, the genuine investigation could not begin. The aporia that the elenchus produced, the honest acknowledgement that the question had not been answered, that the thing one thought one knew was not actually known, this cleared the space. This was the beginning, not the end. Socrates explained this once in a different conversation, in a way that the record has kept. He compared himself to a stingray, Meno, a young man from Thessaly who had come to Athens with the confident expectation of being educated by the sophists, and had ended up, somewhat to his surprise, in conversation with Socrates, made the comparison first as a complaint. Meno said that Socrates was like a stingray in the sea, because everyone who encountered him and his questions came away numb. Meno himself had spoken about virtue many times to many people, and had believed he understood the subject. The conversation with Socrates had taken that understanding away from him without replacing it with anything. He felt numbed, he felt paralyzed, and he was not sure this had done him any good. Socrates, who might have deflected the comparison, or disputed it, or offered a more flattering characterization of what had just happened to Meno, accepted it. He accepted it with something close to gratitude, in the way a person accepts a description that is accurate and recognizes it as accurate. Yes, he said, if the stingray paralyzes others, it is only because the stingray is itself numb. He did not exempt himself from the condition he produced. He was not, in this comparison, a figure of clarity, delivering confusion to those who could not follow him. He was numb too. He shared the perplexity, and he thought, and this is the part that takes the longest to absorb, he thought that the shared perplexity was better, that two men standing honestly at an impasse were in a more philosophically valuable position than one man with a false answer and another man who had not yet discovered the falseness, the numbness. Meno described was not a permanent condition, it was a threshold. It was what it felt like to arrive at honest ground for the first time after years of walking on what turned out to be constructed surface. The interlocutor who arrives at aporia has not been made more ignorant. The interlocutor has been made more accurately aware of what they do not know, which is a different thing entirely. Before the conversation, Euthyphro believed he knew what piety was, and did not know the true state of his own understanding. After the conversation, he did not know what piety was, which he had not known before either, but now he also knew that he did not know. The subtraction, as Socrates conducted it, was not a subtraction of knowledge. It was a subtraction of the illusion of knowledge, which leaves behind exactly what was there all along, the question still open, still in need of genuine attention, no longer obscured by the comfortable sensation of having been answered. There is something about the way Socrates held this practice, the way he arrived at it, the way he performed it, the way he described it in the accounts that survive, that has been difficult to characterize accurately. He claimed, consistently, to know nothing. He asked questions of people who knew things, or believed they knew things, and he asked those questions with a quality of admiration that seemed genuine, because in some sense it was genuine. He was genuinely interested in whether the person in front of him might have the answer to the question he was carrying. He was genuinely uncertain whether his own sense of the difficulty was the correct sense of it, and yet the conversations tended, reliably, to arrive at the same destination, at the unraveling of the confident answer, at the honest acknowledgement of difficulty, at aporia. If Socrates truly knew nothing, these outcomes seem difficult to explain. If he was, as he claimed, approaching each interlocutor from a position of genuine ignorance, how did he so reliably know which questions to ask? The Greek word for what this pose might be is ironia. The English word irony derives from it, though the full range of what the Greek carries does not quite fit the English. Ironia in classical usage carried the sense of dissimulation, of a certain kind of understatement, of saying less than one means in a way that the audience is expected to understand. When applied to Socrates, it named the characteristic behavior of professing ignorance while clearly possessing something. But what that something was, and whether the profession of ignorance was therefore simply false, became a question that philosophers would spend a great deal of time examining. In the 20th century, in a university office surrounded by Greek texts arranged with the careful attention of a man who had spent decades with them, Gregory Vlastos worked through this question with the kind of patient, methodical rigor that philosophical scholarship at its best produces. Vlastos published his conclusions in 1991 in a book that brought together a lifetime of careful reading, and what he found was that the Socratic irony, the profession of ignorance, was neither simple honesty nor simple dissemblance. It was what Vlastos called complex irony, a statement that was simultaneously true at one level and untrue at another, in a way that both levels were genuinely meant. When Socrates said he did not know, he was telling the truth at one level. He did not possess the kind of settled, examined, fully justified understanding that he thought the word knowledge ought to require. But at another level, he was not telling the whole truth. He possessed something, a method, a capacity, a way of following a question that was clearly more than nothing. The irony was not a lie, it was a paradox. It was a statement that honored the real difficulty of the concept being used, while acknowledging the real capacity of the person using it. And the two levels of meaning were inseparable because the capacity itself consisted, at least partly, in understanding the difficulty. This formulation is worth sitting with, not as a proposition to accept or dispute, but as an image of a certain kind of intellectual position. The position of a person who knows, genuinely and at depth, that they do not know, and who has that not knowing not as a passive condition of bewilderment, but as an active, disciplined, practiced orientation toward the questions they carry. The elenchus was not a method for proving one's own ignorance. It was a method for testing whether the understanding claimed by an interlocutor was genuine understanding, or the appearance of understanding, and the testing was done by someone whose own not knowing was real and examined. The person asking the questions did not know the answers, but the person asking the questions had thought carefully and at length about what a real answer would need to look like, about what conditions a satisfying definition would need to meet, about where the ordinary confident answers tended to break down. That is not nothing. It is, in fact, a very specific and quite rare kind of knowledge, the knowledge of what one does not know, and the knowledge of what genuine knowledge, if it arrived, would require. The conversations and the dialogues, the records that survive, held with varying confidence as reflections of something real, have a quality of patience that is part of the philosophical content, not the patience of someone waiting for the other person to arrive at a predetermined destination, the patience of someone genuinely following a question and genuinely uncertain where it will go. When Socrates returned in the Euthyphro to the question about piety, when he tried yet another angle of approach after Euthyphro's previous answers had failed, there was no guarantee in his voice that the next approach would succeed. There was only the commitment to continue looking because the question was worth looking at, and the alternative, accepting one of the inadequate answers and pretending it was sufficient, was a worse condition than the honest impasse. Euthyphro offered, later in the conversation, a more complex definition. He proposed that piety was the part of justice that concerned the service of the gods. This had a satisfying structure. It was more precise than its predecessors, and Socrates received it with genuine interest, turning it to find the next question it raised, rather than dismissing it. What kind of service? Service in what sense? When human beings serve horses or dogs, they aim at the good of those animals, but the gods do not need anything from human beings in the way that horses and dogs need things from their keepers. What does it mean to serve the gods? Euthyphro tried again. The service is like the service of a craftsman to his work. He proposed a kind of assistance that contributes to a larger project. What project? The project of the gods. What is the project of the gods? Their happiness and excellence. But the gods are already happy and excellent. The question circles back into itself. No answer holds long enough to stand on. The conversation ends without resolution. Euthyphro, pressed elsewhere by his legal business, withdraws. The question of what piety is remains exactly as open as it was when the morning began, with the crucial difference that two men now know, clearly and specifically, what answers do not work and why. This is not nothing. It is, in fact, a considerable philosophical achievement, even if it does not feel like one from the inside. Meno's numbness, Euthyphro's frustration, these were accurate reports of how it felt to arrive at genuine philosophical ground after having walked for a long time on something that looked like ground, but was not. The disorientation was real, but the ground itself was more solid than anything that had come before. There is something about the physical setting of these conversations, the stone threshold, the morning air, the sounds of a city behind two men standing still in the middle of it, that belonged to what they were. Socratic dialogue was not a practice conducted in withdrawn spaces. It did not require a school with walls, a library with books, a classroom with a fixed hierarchy of teacher and student. It happened on thresholds, on street corners, in the agora, among the merchants, in the smell of livestock, in the homes of wealthy Athenians who had invited Socrates to dinner and discovered, midway through the meal, that the invitation had been a more ambitious undertaking than they anticipated. The philosophical encounter was embedded in ordinary life, not as a metaphor or a stylistic choice, but as a structural commitment. The questions Socrates was asking about justice, about piety, about virtue, about what constitutes a good life, were questions that arose directly from the activity of living in a city, among other people, questions that mattered in ways that were practical and immediate, questions that any person walking through the agora on any morning might find themselves carrying without knowing it. The craftsman who knew his trade, but confused that knowledge with a general authority on difficult subjects. He was a real figure, not a philosophical abstraction. The politician whose confidence in his own wisdom was proportional to his success and inversely proportional to any genuine examination of his beliefs. He was a real figure, too. The poet who produced work of genuine beauty through some process that neither he nor anyone else could entirely account for, and who therefore assumed this production gave him insight into matters it gave him no particular insight into. Also real, also walking the same streets, also available for conversation. The elenchus was not a method invented in a library and then carried out into the world to test whether the world could accommodate it. It was a response to the actual texture of the world it operated in, the specific, observable, and repeatable phenomenon of human beings who confused competence in one domain for wisdom in general, who mistook familiarity with a subject for knowledge of it, who held their own certainty as evidence of its own reliability. What Socrates did, in each of these conversations was ask the next honest question, not the question designed to embarrass, not the question that would demonstrate his own superior understanding. The next honest question, the one that actually needed to be asked given what had just been said, the one that followed from the conversation rather than being imported into it from outside. The practice required a kind of discipline that was not primarily intellectual, or not intellectual in the narrow sense. It required the discipline of not arriving at a conversation with a fixed destination in mind and then driving the conversation toward it. It required holding the question as genuinely open even when one had thoughts about where the difficulty lay. It required listening carefully enough to what the interlocutor actually said that the next question emerged from that, from the actual words on the actual threshold, rather than from a prepared script of philosophical maneuvers. This quality of listening is easy to underestimate. It is easy from the outside to see the elenchus as a technique, a repeatable sequence of moves, and to miss the fact that its success depended entirely on the quality of attention applied to what each specific interlocutor actually said. The conversations and the dialogues that survive are not the same conversation repeated with different names attached to the person opposite Socrates. They are genuinely different conversations, following the specific paths opened by what was actually said. The Euthyphro's difficulty is a different difficulty from the difficulty in the Meno, or the Laches, or the Charmides. The texture of the aporia that each conversation produces is specific to the question and the interlocutor. The patience Socrates brought to each was not a patience that had worked out in advance where the conversation would go, but a patience that could genuinely follow wherever the question led, including into territory that was unfamiliar, including toward conclusions that were uncomfortable, including toward silence. There were conversations, and the record preserves this, in which no interlocutor was found who had an adequate answer. Socrates returned from his long project of examining Athenian politicians and poets and craftsmen, the project the oracle had set him on, without quite intending to set him on it, by declaring that no one was wiser than he, and the consistent finding of that project was not that wisdom was evenly distributed, or that it resided in unexpected places. The consistent finding was that no one, so far, had it. The politicians lacked it. The poets who had produced things of real beauty did not understand the beauty they had produced, and so could not be said to know it in the way that would matter. The craftsmen had something real and specific in their own domains, but they let that real thing expand into claims about other domains where it could not reach. Nobody seemed to have the thing that Socrates was looking for: genuine, examined, justified understanding of the most important questions, and this was not a conclusion he seemed to find satisfying. He would have been glad to find someone wiser. He would have been relieved. The project of spending one's life asking everyone in Athens whether they knew what virtue was, and consistently finding that they did not, is not the project of a man who enjoys being the most knowledgeable person in the room. It is the project of a man who keeps genuinely hoping that this next person will be the one who knows. The interlocutor arriving at aporia, the moment Meno described, of numbness, of having been more certain before the conversation than after it. This was not a destination Socrates sought to bring people to as an end in itself. The aporia was not the point. It was a threshold. It was what a mind that had stopped carrying its false certainty felt like, while it was still adjusting to the weight it had put down. The sensation of having nothing to hold onto after having held something for a long time, even if what was held was not what one thought it was. That sensation was real, and Socrates did not dismiss it. He shared it. He said with what seems like genuine honesty that he was as numb as Mano, that he did not know the answers, that the inquiry was as much his own as the interlocutor's. The stingray that paralyzes others is itself numb. And then the next question, after the numbness, or inside it, or carried gently through it, the next question. Not a question that will resolve the difficulty, not a question that leads confidently towards solid ground, but the question that honestly follows from where the conversation has arrived, the question that the honest acknowledgement of not knowing makes available. The mind that has put down its false certainty is for the first time genuinely available to the question, not defending a position, not looking for confirmation, available, open, in the condition that is the beginning of genuine philosophical attention, which is the condition of not already knowing the answer. There is a quality of openness that the elenchus produces, not manufactured, not performed, but actual, that is difficult to describe without using the wrong words. It is not the openness of blankness, of a mind that is simply stopped. It is the openness of a field that has been cleared. The work of clearing is real work, and the result of it looks from the inside for a time like loss. But what has been cleared away was not knowledge. What has been cleared away was the occupation of the space where knowledge could be, by something that had the density and weight of knowledge without its substance. What remains, in the silence after the clearing, is the question itself, the actual question, the question that was always there, behind the confident answers, waiting for the confident answers to be set aside. On that threshold outside the King Archon's court, in the early morning with the city waking up behind them, two men stood at the end of a conversation about piety that had found no answer. Euthyphro left to attend to his prosecution. Socrates continued toward his own legal business, carrying the same question he had been carrying for years, no closer to a satisfying answer, and no less certain that the question deserved the attention he had given it. The threshold itself, physical stone, worn smooth by feet, on a morning like other mornings, was unchanged by what had passed between two people standing on it. The city continued, the question continued. What the elenchus left behind, in the space where a confident answer had been, was not emptiness. It was something closer to the honest shape of the difficulty, the question in its actual form, stripped of the comfortable approximations that had made it seem resolved. A question held in this way, known to be unanswered, known to be difficult, known to have resisted every approach so far, has a particular quality of weight and stillness, not the weight of something that must be solved tonight, not the urgency of a problem demanding resolution, the weight of something old and patient that has waited this long and will wait longer, that does not require a final answer in order to remain worth carrying, that asks only to be held honestly, with the acknowledgement that it has not been answered, and that the not answering is not a failure of attention, but a faithful report of the actual difficulty. The aporia that the conversation produced was not a wall, it was a clearing, a place the mind arrived at when it had set down everything it was carrying, the definitions that did not hold, the certainties that had not survived examination, the comfortable sense of having already understood what was most worth understanding. What remained in that clearing was the question itself, resting now in its genuine form, open to the air, no longer obscured by anything. There was no urgency in this place. There was only the question, still and patient in the early morning, asking nothing from anyone that could not wait until the mind that held it had rested enough to follow it further, if it chose to, in whatever quiet hours came next. In the prison cell, the light comes in at a low angle. It falls across the floor in a long pale strip, the kind of light that belongs to middle afternoon, when the day has lost its urgency and the city outside is quieter than it was. The cell is small, the walls are stone. There is, by all accounts, enough room to sit, to lie down, to have a conversation. There are people in and out, guards, friends, a philosopher named Crito who has spent 30 days finding reasons why none of this should be happening. Socrates has had writing materials available, or something close enough to them. He has not used them. In 30 days, under sentence of death, in a cell where nothing prevented him from setting down whatever he wished to say, the man who spent his entire adult life asking questions about knowledge, virtue, and the right way to live did not write a single word. The page, or whatever stood in for one, remained unmarked. The silence of that unmarked surface is not an absence. It is one of the most philosophically significant facts about the entire tradition that follows from him. It is worth sitting with that silence for a moment before explaining it, or before offering any of the many explanations that have been offered. There it is, a man in his 70s, perhaps the most relentlessly thoughtful person his city had ever produced, choosing not to write. Everything that is known about him comes from someone else. Everything that is attributed to him is filtered through another mind, another style, another set of concerns. He is, in this sense, the most mediated philosopher in the Western tradition, and perhaps, depending on how one holds it, the most honest. The question of who Socrates actually was has occupied scholars for as long as there have been scholars to ask it. The difficulty has a name, the Socratic problem, and the problem is not the kind that more diligent research will eventually resolve. It is structural, running all the way down into the nature of the sources. Every account of Socrates that survives was written by someone with reasons of their own, reasons of friendship, rivalry, philosophical investment, or literary ambition, and none of those accounts is what we would now call a neutral record. There was no neutral record. Socrates left none, and the people who knew him wrote down what they needed to write down, which was not necessarily, or even primarily, the same thing. What survives, then, is a set of portraits. They are skillfully made. Some of them are extraordinary works of philosophical art, but they are portraits, not photographs, and the differences between them are significant enough that a reader encountering them without prior preparation would not immediately know they were looking at the same man. Plato is the most famous painter. His dialogues, some of the finest prose produced by any ancient writer in any language, give Socrates a voice so vivid and distinctive that it has been hard, across 24 centuries, to remember that the voice is also Plato's. Plato was a young man when Socrates died, perhaps 28 or 29. He had been a devoted companion and student. The grief of that loss and the philosophical energy it generated drove the composition of dialogues that began, by most scholarly accounts, relatively close to the historical figure and moved, as the decades passed, steadily further into Plato's own developing philosophical territory. The question of where Socrates ends and Plato begins is one of the oldest and most genuinely difficult questions in classical philosophy. The early dialogues carry a particular feel. The Apology, the Euthyphro, the Crito, the Laches, these texts are characterized by endings that do not resolve, by a Socrates who consistently claims to know nothing and seems to mean it, by a philosophical atmosphere in which honest uncertainty is both the method and the conclusion. Characters arrive confident and leave perplexed. Socrates himself arrives curious and leaves curious. No one, including him, goes home with an answer in hand. Whatever these dialogues are doing, they are not building toward a doctrine. They are building toward a quality of honest openness that treats the question itself as the thing worth having. The middle dialogues feel different. The Phaedo, the Symposium, the Republic, here the philosophical voice has expanded into a different register. There is still a figure called Socrates, asking questions, guiding conversations, but the conversations are going somewhere now. They are building towards something. The philosopher who once claimed to know only his own ignorance begins in these texts to advance a series of sweeping, confident, beautiful claims about the structure of reality. There are, he argues in these dialogues, eternal and unchanging forms, archetypes of beauty, justice, equality, goodness, existing beyond the world of ordinary experience, accessible not to the senses, but to the intellect alone. The physical world, with its shifting appearances and perishable things, is a realm of shadows and imitations. The philosopher's task is to ascend, through rigorous intellectual effort, toward the direct apprehension of these forms, which constitute the only genuine knowledge there is. It is a magnificent vision. It is also, most scholars now hold, Plato's own, the Socrates of the early dialogues, the one who found no one wiser than himself, because he at least knew he knew nothing. That figure does not obviously lead to the Socrates of the Republic, who claims access to the highest realities of being. The early and middle dialogues are separated not just by years of composition, but by a philosophical ambition that seems to have grown in the writing beyond what its nominal speaker could comfortably carry. The theory of forms gives the philosopher, at its summit, positive knowledge of the highest order. Socratic ignorance, within this framework, becomes a transitional phase, the honest acknowledgement of not yet knowing that precedes the ascent toward genuine understanding. It is not the final condition, it is the necessary starting point. What had been, in the earlier texts, a permanent and even dignified epistemic state becomes in the later framework a rung on a ladder that leads somewhere definite and grand. There is an image in the Republic, the allegory of the cave, that gives this ascent its most famous form. Prisoners are chained in an underground chamber facing a stone wall. Behind them burns a fire. Between the fire and the prisoners, objects are carried back and forth, and their shadows fall on the wall in front. The prisoners have never seen anything else. They take the shadows for reality, name them, argue about their nature, develop sophisticated theories about the patterns of shadow movement. Their entire epistemology is an epistemology of surfaces. One prisoner is released, turned toward the fire. He is blinded by light he has never seen. Brought up out of the cave into full daylight, he is more blinded still, and in pain, and wishes to return to the familiar darkness, where at least the shadows were comprehensible. But gradually his eyes adjust. He begins to see the objects whose shadows he mistook for the whole of reality. Then the sky, then stars, then the moon, finally the sun itself, the source of all light, all visibility, all being. This is what knowledge looks like in Plato's telling, a painful, gradual, irreversible ascent from appearance toward reality, from shadow toward source. Whether the historical Socrates ever described anything in quite these terms is a question scholars approach with genuine caution. The vision of ascent, the prisoner's painful turning toward the light, the sun as metaphor for the form of the good, these have the character of Plato's mature philosophical imagination, which was an extraordinary thing and knew its own reach. The Socrates of the early dialogues was more interested in the shadows the prisoners were getting wrong than in the sun above the cave's mouth. Or, if that is too strong, there is at least no early dialogue that reads as a straightforward preparation for what the Republic unfolds. The philosophical gap between these two Socrateses, the aporetic, uncertain figure of the early texts, and the guide toward forms in the middle texts, is part of what makes the other major ancient source so valuable. Xenophon, a contemporary of Plato's and also a companion of Socrates, wrote his own accounts, the Memorabilia, his own Symposium, his own Apology. The Socrates who appears in these texts is, in many respects, a different man. Xenophon's Socrates is practical. He is concerned with self-sufficiency, with the management of household and friendship, with conventional civic duty and conventional piety. He has opinions about how to choose a general, and how to treat one's parents, and what makes a man useful to his city. He is consistently admirable, consistently sensible, and consistently free of the vertiginous metaphysical ambition that Plato's dialogues will eventually give him. He does not appear to be deeply interested in eternal forms or the ascent of the philosopher toward the highest realities of being. He appears to be interested, with great seriousness and good practical judgment, in how to live well among other people in a particular city. This is not a lesser Socrates. It may, some scholars have argued, be a more historically reliable one. Xenophon was not a philosopher by vocation. He was a general, a historian, a practical man of action who happened to have known Socrates personally and wanted to defend his reputation after the trial and execution. His account does not bear the marks of philosophical elaboration in the direction of a systematic metaphysics. It bears the marks of someone remembering a man who was genuinely good and genuinely wise in everyday, practical, comprehensible terms. Put Xenophon's Socrates and Plato's early Socrates side by side, and there is considerable convergence. Both figures are committed to honest self-examination. Both are skeptical of conventional pretensions to knowledge. Both treat the care of one's own soul as more important than the accumulation of wealth or reputation. Put Xenophon's Socrates and Plato's middle Socrates side by side, and the distance between them is large enough to constitute a genuinely open question about which portrait is pointing, however indirectly, at the historical man. The honest answer is that both are pointing at something real, and neither is pointing at everything. Xenophon knew him and loved him and wrote about the aspects of him that mattered most within his own frame of reference. Plato knew him and loved him and wrote a long series of texts whose philosophical ambition eventually carried them well beyond the limits of biographical record into territory that was clearly and magnificently Plato's own. The historical Socrates is somewhere between these portraits, or behind them, or perhaps distributed across both of them in proportions that cannot now be precisely determined. There is a word for this predicament, the Socratic problem, but the word matters less than the experience of sitting with it honestly. The experience is something like standing between two accounts of a person one has never met, both accounts credible, both partial, neither willing to concede ground to the other, and realizing gradually that the gap between them is not a failure of the sources, but a feature of the subject. Socrates, who insisted more consistently than almost anyone else in the ancient record that claims to knowledge must be tested, and that confident certainty is precisely the thing most likely to be wrong, has made it structurally impossible for any subsequent account to claim the certainty it would need in order to close the question of who he was. This is either a scholarly frustration or a philosophical gift, depending on how one holds it. There is a case for the latter, and the man whose method was to dissolve the false certainties of those who thought they knew more than they did, continues, 24 centuries after his death, to dissolve false certainties about himself. No account of Socrates, including ancient ones, including Plato's own, can be presented as definitively complete without immediately inviting the scrutiny he himself would have brought to any confident claim. He is, in this sense, the only philosopher whose legacy is most faithfully honored by remaining appropriately unsure about what his legacy is. This does not leave the reader or listener with nothing. There are things that seem, across the sources, consistent and settled enough to carry genuine weight. The practice of rigorous self examination, the conviction that a life not subjected to questioning is not fully lived, the specific uncomfortable honesty of admitting that one does not know what one thought one knew, the willingness to let that admission stand without rushing to fill the space it opens with a substitute certainty. These appear in Plato's early texts and in Xenophon's, and in the fragments of other writers who mention Socrates, and whatever their precise biographical accuracy, they describe a consistent philosophical posture that the later tradition found so compelling it could not stop returning to it. There is, inside the Platonic corpus, a moment that carries an unusual degree of philosophical weight, in part because it involves Socrates demonstrating his method on someone who has no philosophical training at all. In the Meno, Socrates is speaking with a young slave boy, unnamed, brought into the conversation at Meno's request, presumably unaccustomed to being asked to reason about anything. Socrates asks him a series of questions about geometry. The boy has not studied geometry. He has not studied anything formal, and yet, through questions alone, no instruction, no information transmitted from teacher to student in the ordinary sense, he arrives at a correct answer about the relationship between the areas of squares. The demonstration is careful and unhurried. Socrates first establishes what the boy already thinks he knows, which turns out to be wrong. The boy confidently gives an answer. It is incorrect. Socrates does not correct him directly. He asks a question that makes the error visible to the boy himself. The boy resets. He tries again. He gets it wrong in a different direction. He is, for a moment, genuinely puzzled, the specific kind of puzzlement that arises when one discovers that what seemed solid is not, and then, through the continued questions, through the slow, patient work of reasoning rather than receiving, he arrives at something closer to the truth. What has happened here, in Plato's telling, is philosophically remarkable. The boy did not learn geometry in the ordinary sense of acquiring information. He did not have before. He recovered something, a capacity for geometrical reasoning, an implicit knowledge of spatial relations that was already in some form present in him. Learning, in this account, is not filling an empty vessel. It is uncovering what was always there, waiting for the right questions to make it visible. This is the doctrine of anamnesis, recollection. Plato frames it as a consequence of the soul's immortality. Before birth, the soul existed in direct contact with the eternal forms, acquiring knowledge of them in their pure and unchanging state. At birth, that knowledge is obscured but not destroyed. The philosopher's task and the teacher's task is to ask the questions that allow recollection to occur. Learning is a kind of remembering. Knowledge is not generated by experience, but recovered from a pre-experiential depth that experience, properly questioned, can access. Whether the historical Socrates held this doctrine in anything like this form is a question the sources do not settle. The doctrine of anamnesis requires a theory of the soul's immortality and a metaphysics of eternal forms, both of which belong by most scholarly accounts to Plato's mature philosophical development, rather than to the questioning, uncertain figure of the earlier dialogues. The demonstration with the slave boy may preserve a genuine Socratic practice, the use of questions to bring forth capacities that seemed absent, while the metaphysical framework constructed around it may be Plato's own. But the practice itself, whatever its metaphysical underpinning, is arresting. A man arrives, confident that he knows something. He is asked questions. He discovers that he does not know it in the way he thought he did. He becomes genuinely uncertain. And then, out of that honest uncertainty, not despite it, but through it, something real begins to emerge. The geometry does not come from Socrates' telling. It comes from the boy's own capacity to reason, unlocked by the right sequence of patient questions. There is a version of this that does not require eternal souls or pre-birth contact with forms to be philosophically interesting. It is simply the observation that careful questioning can bring a person to genuine understanding in a way that direct instruction cannot, because understanding, as distinct from the mere reception of information, requires that something happen inside the person doing the thinking. Questions create the conditions for that happening. Explanations, delivered from outside, can be accepted or rejected on the surface, without anything in the questioner actually changing. Plato is seated at his desk, wherever and whenever that was, sometime in the 4th century BCE, in Athens or Syracuse or somewhere between them, writing the words of a man who never wrote. There is something inherently paradoxical about this image, and Plato was not unaware of it. In a late dialogue called the Phaedrus, the Socrates Plato has constructed turns around and criticizes writing itself. Written words, Plato's Socrates argues, cannot answer questions or adjust their message to the person reading them. They present the same face to every reader, regardless of whether that reader is ready to receive what is being said. They create the appearance of knowledge in people who have merely acquired information, which is precisely the kind of false certainty that the elenchus method was designed to dissolve. It is a remarkable moment in the history of philosophy, one of the most influential writers in any ancient tradition, writing a critique of writing in the voice of a man who did not write. Whether this reflects genuine ambivalence on Plato's part, or a sophisticated philosophical position about the limits of written transmission, or simply the irony of a tradition that cannot quite escape, there it is. The written dialogue, however beautifully constructed, is already, in some sense, an approximation of what the living conversation was. The living conversation was with a man who chose not to write, whose philosophical practice was irreducibly oral, irreducibly personal, irreducibly present, one human being questioning another in the specific light of a specific day. Part of what is philosophically significant about Socrates leaving nothing written is that it forecloses the kind of authority that written doctrine confers. A philosopher who writes a system gives readers something to agree with or reject, to extend or criticize, to summarize and transmit and teach. The system acquires a certain independence from its author. It can be carried into contexts the author never anticipated, defended by people who never met the author, disputed by people born centuries after the author's death. This is precisely what happened to Plato, and to Aristotle, and to almost every significant philosopher in the written tradition. Their arguments outlive them in fixed form, subject to examination, in exactly the way arguments in fixed form always are. Socrates' arguments, if they can be called that, since he claimed not to have any, existed only in conversation, only in the dynamic back and forth of two people actually thinking together in real time. The moment the conversation ended, the argument could not be extracted and preserved without losing something essential about its nature. The argument, in a certain sense, was the conversation itself. What it pointed toward was not a position, but a practice. The practice of asking, honestly, whether one knows what one thinks one knows, and being genuinely open to discovering that one does not. This is what Plato tried to preserve in the dialogue form, and he preserved a great deal. But the Plato who writes the early dialogues knows somewhere in his construction of them that he is building an approximation. The aporetic endings, the conversations that close without resolution, the interlocutors who go away genuinely perplexed, the Socrates who says at the end that he is no closer to knowing what piety is than he was at the start. These have the quality of a writer trying to honor the incompleteness of the original practice rather than tidying it into something more comfortable. The question remains open. It is supposed to remain open. The open question is the closest thing the dialogue has to offer in place of the living conversation. As Plato's career extended, as the philosophical project grew larger and more ambitious, the aporetic discipline of the early text gradually gave way to something more constructive. The man who knew nothing became, over decades of careful writing, the guide to a vision of reality so comprehensive and so beautiful that it became one of the most influential philosophical systems ever produced. The forms are eternal, the soul is immortal, knowledge is possible. The ascent from the cave leads eventually to the light. These are affirmations, not the honest suspensions of the early dialogues. They are answers, not the sustained openness of a man who claimed to have none. This transformation is not a betrayal. It is what happens when an extraordinary philosophical mind engages seriously and over a long period with questions that resist settlement. Plato did not stop being honest. He developed a different kind of honesty, one that tried to articulate what the philosophical aspiration points toward, rather than resting in the perplexity at its beginning. The early Socrates and the later Plato are both serious engagements with the question of what knowledge is and what kind of life it makes possible. They simply occupy different points on a long arc of inquiry, but they are different, and the difference matters for anyone trying to understand what, in the whole tradition, is most authentically Socratic. The historian of philosophy Gregory Vlastos, who spent decades in careful attention to these texts, drew the distinction with considerable precision. The historical Socrates, as far as the early dialogues allow reconstruction, was a moral philosopher who practiced rigorous examination of ethical claims without advancing a metaphysical system of his own. He wanted to know how to live well. He had found that no one around him knew this with the clarity they claimed. He believed that the honest admission of not knowing was the necessary precondition for any genuine inquiry into the question. Beyond that, he did not know, and said so, and lived in that honest uncertainty with something that looked, in all the accounts, very much like serenity. What Plato did with this, over 30 years and 26 dialogues, was build a philosophical world large enough to hold it, a world where the uncertainty of the early Socrates finds its eventual resolution in the forms, where the perplexity of someone who does not know what justice is becomes the beginning of a journey toward the knowledge of justice itself in its eternal, unchanging nature. It is a magnificent answer to the question Socrates was living. It may not be the answer Socrates himself would have recognized as his own. Two portraits, then, held side by side, neither canceling the other, both pointing at something the other has not quite captured. Plato's Socrates, two of them in fact, the early questioning figure and the later guide toward forms, and Xenophon's Socrates, the practical moralist and civic exemplar. The historical man moves among these portraits the way a light source moves behind a series of translucent screens, casting recognizable shapes on each one, without being fully captured by any. The question of who Socrates was is not, in the end, a question that frustrates. It is a question that does something philosophically useful, which is to make the answering of it as difficult as the question Socrates himself asked. Anyone who has thought carefully about what justice is, or what knowledge is, or what it means to live well, knows that these questions resist the confident summary that satisfied the politicians and poets Socrates visited in the Apology. The question of who Socrates was has the same structure. It resists confident summary in exactly the measure that any honest engagement with it demands. The man who taught that no account of virtue could be trusted until it had been tested under rigorous questioning has made his own legacy impossible to account for without testing it in the same way.
This is not a loss. It's a kind of continued presence.
The figure who emerges from the accumulated portraits, a paretic, courageous, unseducible by comfort, committed to honest uncertainty as a philosophical practice rather than a rhetorical posture, continues to be, across every account, the most productive interlocutor in the tradition. He is most productive precisely because he cannot be pinned down into a system that can be learned and reported without being lived. To understand him, one has to do something like what he did: hold the question open, resist the premature answer, sit honestly in the uncertainty without mistaking it for the end of the inquiry. The unwritten page in the prison cell, the afternoon light falling in a long strip across the stone floor, the writing materials unused. Outside, the city continuing in its ordinary way, the market, the harbor, the colonnades where arguments were still being made about justice and the good life, and whether the gods cared about any of it. Inside, a man choosing, in the time that remained to him, not to fix his thoughts in the form that would have preserved them most legibly, because perhaps he understood that the most honest thing he could leave behind was not a fixed answer, but the permanent openness of the questions themselves. Plato at one table, Xenophon at another, across years and perhaps across cities, each writing down a man neither of them could fully hold, each creating, in the act of writing, a Socrates shaped by what they needed Socrates to be, and yet each also reaching, with genuine effort and genuine fidelity, towards something that exceeded what their particular version of it could contain. The portraits stand together in the tradition, both serious, both partial, both pointing past themselves toward a figure who slips behind each account the moment any account claims to be complete. There is something quietly right about this. The tradition that begins with Socrates is in important ways a tradition about the limits of what any account can claim. The man at the center of it has, simply by refusing to write, made sure that the tradition practices what it preaches. Every scholar who has spent a careful life trying to determine what the historical Socrates actually believed has encountered, at some point in the inquiry, the same honest impasse that Socrates' interlocutors encountered in the agora, the moment when the path of confident assertion runs to its edge, and there is nothing beyond it but the open question, patient and wide, and entirely untroubled by the fact that it has not been answered yet. Two portraits held gently, the space between them not empty but full, full of everything the portraits cannot hold, full of the honest acknowledgement that some figures are most truly met in the recognition that they exceed every account made of them, and that this exceeding is not a failure, but the most faithful legacy a philosopher committed to honest unknowing could possibly leave. The light in the cell moves slowly, as afternoon light does. It crosses the floor. The writing materials remain still. Somewhere in the city, conversations are being held. Questions are being asked, and the careful, patient work of inquiry, which does not require a system or a school or a set of written doctrines to continue, continues. Somewhere along the Danube, in a military encampment that has been cold since September, a lamp is burning after the other lamps have gone out. The man sitting with it is not young. His back aches from the saddle and from years of carrying the particular weight that falls on those who must decide things for other people. Outside, the river moves without any awareness of being observed. Inside, in the small circle of the lamp, a pen is moving across a page. He is not writing to anyone. He is not composing an argument. He is reviewing, in the careful and almost ruthless way he has practiced for years, whether the day just ended was the day of a man who lived according to what he believed, or the day of a man who merely said he did. The distinction matters to him more than any of the military questions that filled the hours between dawn and this lamp. He writes, asterisk, I have done harm today through anger. I could have checked that. There was time, asterisk. Then he writes something more careful, more patient about what anger is and what it is not, and what the difference costs a person over a life. His name is Marcus Aurelius. He is, by the common measure of things, the most powerful person alive, and he is in this tent, in this dark, doing what a barefoot philosopher in Athens had argued was the only kind of work that genuinely matters, examining, without flattery or excuse, the content and quality of his own mind. The book he is making will not be published. He will never read it again after the night he writes each page. It is not a monument and not a performance. It is a practice, in the original sense of that word, something done repeatedly, in private, not to achieve a destination, but to maintain a bearing. The Stoic philosophers who shaped Marcus Aurelius had inherited this practice from somewhere older, from arguments that had been circulating in Athens for nearly 6 centuries by the time he sat with his lamp on the frontier. They had taken one sentence from those arguments and made it the foundation of everything, that the unexamined life is not worth living, and every evening review, every private accounting, every page of this journal that no one was ever meant to read, all of it was a variation on that sentence. All of it was, in a particular and serious sense, still Socratic. What the Stoics had taken from those old Athenian arguments was something quite specific, not the method of public questioning, not the dialogues in the agora, not the irony or the cross-examination. What they had taken was the underlying premise that the quality of a human life is determined not by what happens to it from the outside, but by what happens inside, in the continuous examination of how one is thinking and choosing and attending. Zeno of Citium, who had founded the Stoic school in Athens centuries before Marcus Aurelius was born, had positioned Socrates as the ancestor of everything Stoicism was trying to do. The man who had demonstrated, by living the way he lived, that the examined self was both the proper subject and the proper instrument of philosophy. Epictetus, who had been a slave, had taught from this same premise. Seneca, writing letters he knew might outlast him, had written from it too. And Marcus Aurelius, in the tent with the lamp on the Danube, was still inside it, the long unbroken thread of a practice that had never quite stopped running since the morning Socrates first asked someone in the agora whether they had considered what justice actually was. The thread runs further than Marcus Aurelius and in other directions than the Stoics. Soren Kierkegaard was born in Copenhagen in 1813, which is to say, he was born into a world that had been arguing about philosophy for a very long time, and had accumulated, in those centuries of argument, a great deal of confident doctrine. There were schools and systems. There were professors who taught the truth in systematic order. There were books that claimed to have resolved the questions that had troubled the ancients, to have built, finally, a philosophy complete enough to encompass everything worth knowing. Kierkegaard had read all of it, and the more he read, the more he felt something was wrong, not with any particular argument, but with the manner of the whole enterprise, with the assumption that truth was something that could be handed over in a lecture, received passively, and taken home and shelved. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on Socratic irony. He spent more than 200 pages arguing that what Socrates had done, withholding conclusions, refusing to teach directly, answering questions with questions, was not a rhetorical limitation, not a clever technique for making people feel involved. It was a principled commitment to the idea that certain kinds of truth cannot be delivered from the outside. They must be found from the inside. A conclusion that arrives already assembled, already argued through, already certain of itself, is a conclusion the listener can accept or reject without having genuinely encountered it, without having gone through the process by which it became true. Socrates had understood this, Kierkegaard argued, and had built his entire practice around the refusal to short-circuit that process. He would not give you the answer because the answer was not the point. The point was the honest movement of your own mind toward the edge of what it knew, and the moment it stood there, genuinely uncertain, genuinely open, that was the moment philosophy could begin. Kierkegaard would go on to write most of his books under other names. His most important works arrived in the world attributed to fictional characters: Victor Eremita, Johannes Climacus, Anticlimacus. Pseudonyms he chose with such care that readers argued for years about which voice was really his. He was engineering, in literary form, the same thing he had argued Socrates engineered in conversation, a space the reader could not simply walk through without choosing to enter it. The indirect communication, the deliberate withholding, the refusal to simply state the conclusion and be done, all of this was a practice he had learned over years of slow and patient reading from a man who died in 399 BCE and had written nothing at all. What Kierkegaard had found in Socrates, a medieval theologian in a very different kind of room, had found in a different direction and by a different name. Meister Eckhart was a Dominican friar in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, a scholar of considerable learning and a preacher of considerable daring. He taught in Paris and Cologne. He was concerned with a question that might seem entirely unlike anything Socrates had been concerned with: how to speak truthfully about God. The difficulty he had encountered was this: every statement one made about the divine seemed, on examination, to be too small for what it was trying to name. To say that God is good is to say something true and insufficient at the same time, because the goodness one is drawing on for comparison is a human creaturely goodness, and whatever the divine reality is, it exceeds that comparison in a way the comparison cannot capture. To say God is great runs into the same problem. So does wise and powerful and loving. Every positive description adds something, and everything it adds is already too limited. Eckhart's response to this was to turn systematically toward what could not be said, to describe the divine by removing descriptions, to move toward truth by the disciplined removal of inadequate language, until what remains is not a statement, but a silence that knows what it is, silent about. This tradition has a name: apophatic theology, sometimes called negative theology. Its practitioners include Pseudo-Dionysius, who wrote in late antiquity, and Maimonides, who wrote in 12th century Cairo. Across all these different centuries and circumstances, the shape of the practice is the same. The approach to a highest subject through the honest removal of everything that does not quite fit, until what is left is not an answer, but a more honest standing at the edge of an answer. The structural parallel to Socratic unknowing is not a coincidence that scholars have missed. Pierre Hadot, who spent his working life reading ancient philosophy with unusual patience and care, noticed it. Denise Turner, writing on Christian mysticism, has traced it carefully. What both traditions share is the conviction that genuine approach to the highest subject, whether that subject is divine reality or genuine wisdom, requires the systematic negation of false certainty. The via negativa and the elenchus are not the same practice, but they share a common premise that the honest acknowledgement of what one does not know is not a failure of inquiry, but its most rigorous form, that the most careful thinker is the one who has learned not to mistake the edge of what they know for the edge of what is real. Eckhart preaching in a German church, Maimonides writing philosophy in Arabic in a city on the edge of two worlds, Pseudo-Dionysius composing in Greek at the fringe of two traditions, all of them arriving from very different starting points at the same posture, hands open. The last confident claim set down, the silence at the limit of language, acknowledged not as emptiness, but as the most honest place one can stand. That posture, hands open, the last confident claim set down, is what Michel Foucault was writing about in the final months of his life. Foucault delivered his last lecture series at the Collège de France in the early 1980s. He was ill, and he knew it, though the lectures do not perform illness or urgency. They are careful lectures. They are the work of a man who has something particular to say, and is saying it with precision and without theatrical haste. The subject he had arrived at, after a career that had moved through the history of madness, the history of punishment, the history of how knowledge constitutes its subjects, was something he called asterisk parrhesia. Asterisk, a Greek word that means frank speech or courageous truth-telling, the willingness to say what one actually sees, even when the audience would prefer not to hear it. He traced this practice back through the texts, looking for its earliest and most clarifying instances, and he arrived, in those final lectures, at Socrates standing in the agora. What Foucault saw in that figure was not primarily a philosopher engaged in abstract inquiry. He saw a particular form of life organized around the willingness to tell the truth about what one found, regardless of the consequence, a form of life in which truth-telling was not an intellectual exercise, but a moral commitment made with the whole person. Socrates had not simply argued about justice in abstract terms. He had stood in the middle of a city and said to everyone who would listen, and many who would not, that their most confident beliefs about virtue and knowledge and the good life did not hold up when examined carefully. He had done this for decades. He had done it knowing it would make enemies. And when the consequences arrived, in the form of a trial and a verdict and a sentence, he had declined the several available avenues of escape and accepted the consequences of having been, his whole life, exactly what he had claimed to be. Foucault read this not as martyrdom and not as tragedy. He read it as the logical structure of a life organized around asterisk parrhesia. Asterisk, the man who commits to speaking what he actually finds, without adjusting his speech to the preferences of his audience, takes on a particular kind of risk, the risk that the truth he is committed to will be inconvenient, unwelcome, destabilizing. Socrates had taken that risk consciously and had sustained it for a long life. The trial was not an accident that befell a philosopher. It was the culmination of a philosophical practice carried all the way through. There was something in this reading that Foucault returned to with patience and without apparent distress, even as the lectures were being delivered by a man who was running out of time to deliver them. He was tracing a line from the 5th century BCE to the present, not to argue that nothing had changed, not to suggest that modern philosophy had simply continued what Socrates began, but to identify something structural in the practice of honest truth-telling that had persisted in various forms across the centuries in between, and that still had something to show the present moment about what it meant to take one's own thinking seriously enough to stake something on it. The lectures were published after Foucault's death. They are called *The Courage of Truth*. The title is Socratic in its simplicity. The courage being named is not dramatic or extraordinary. It is the ordinary, sustained, daily courage of saying what one sees and living accordingly. The line Foucault was tracing, from Socrates to the present, runs through all the figures in these centuries of philosophy, and it runs in the same direction, whether the philosopher following it knows they are following it or not. Pierre Hadot had traced a different aspect of the same line. Hadot had spent years reading the Stoics and the Epicureans and the Platonists and the Neoplatonists, and what he had found, patient page by patient page, was that these schools were not primarily theoretical enterprises. They were not, in the first instance, concerned with constructing the most accurate possible account of reality. They were concerned with the transformation of the person doing the inquiring, with using philosophy as a set of lived practices that would change over time the quality of attention one brought to one's own life. The practices Hadot cataloged were various. There were contemplative exercises, and exercises in the imagination, and exercises in reframing misfortune, and exercises in the voluntary experience of difficulty. But at the foundation of all of them, in every school he examined, he found something that he traced back to Socrates, the practice of self-examination, the daily or nightly turning of honest attention inward, not to find a self that is already complete and admirable, but to see, as clearly as possible, what is actually there, what one actually believes, as distinct from what one would prefer to believe, what one actually values, as distinct from what one claims to value, what one has actually done, and what one has avoided looking at. Hadot argued that this practice was not merely one exercise among others, it was the foundational one. Everything else the ancient schools built, the contemplative ascents of the Neoplatonists, the evening reviews of the Stoics, the Epicurean cultivation of friendship and simple pleasure, rested on this prior commitment to seeing oneself honestly. And this prior commitment had its origin, or at least its clearest and most demanding early expression, in what Socrates had practiced and taught in the Agora, the idea that the unexamined life is a life in which one is, in some fundamental sense, absent from oneself. The Stoic Evening Review, the Epicurean practice of philosophical friendship as a form of mutual self-examination, the Neoplatonic contemplative ascent beginning in honest acknowledgement of ignorance, the apophatic theologian's systematic negation of inadequate concepts, Kierkegaard's indirect communication, refusing to deliver conclusions that the reader must find for themselves, Foucault's courageous truth-teller, staking something real on what they genuinely find. All of these, traced carefully back along the lines of influence and argument, lead through philosophy's long centuries to a man who stood in a marketplace in Athens and claimed to know nothing and meant it and made it the beginning of everything. The night is late now. The Danube moves outside the tent where Marcus Aurelius has set down his pen. The lamp is lower. What he has written will not change the campaign or the empire or any of the large external events that will be decided by factors beyond his control. What it might change, What the practice is designed to change, slowly and without drama over the years of doing it, is the quality of presence he brings to those events, whether he is genuinely there, genuinely attending, genuinely himself in the moments that ask something of him, or whether he is merely performing the role while the self that would actually inhabit it remains unexamined, automatic, unfree. That distinction between the life that is genuinely lived and the life that is only enacted is very old. It was there in the questions Socrates was asking centuries before Marcus Aurelius was born. It was there in the medieval theologian's careful insistence that one not mistake the name for the thing. It was there in Kierkegaard's refusal to hand over conclusions that would let his readers mistake receiving a truth for genuinely finding it. It was there in Foucault's last careful lectures, tracing the line back to see where the practice of honest speech had begun and why it had cost its most famous early practitioner everything he had. The thread does not break, it does not converge toward an answer. Philosophy, taken seriously across its long span, does not produce a final truth that resolves the question Socrates was asking. What it produces in those who stay with it long enough is something different and perhaps more durable, the capacity to remain inside the questions without panic, to find in the honest acknowledgement of not knowing something that functions slowly and quietly, like rest. That capacity is what the apophatic theologians were practicing when they cleared away every inadequate description and stood in the resulting silence. It is what the Stoics were building when they reviewed each evening, not to condemn themselves, but to see clearly. It is what Kierkegaard was protecting when he refused to simply state his conclusions in his own voice. It is what Foucault was honoring when he spent his final working months tracing the line between truth-telling and courage, between genuine speech and the comfort of saying only what is welcome. And it is, in a way that is not metaphorical and not forced, still available. Not as a curriculum or a practice program or a set of exercises to be undertaken in sequence, simply as the question itself, which has not aged, which asks nothing dramatic, which does not require anything more than a willingness to sit inside it without immediately reaching for an answer. What do I actually know? What have I assumed rather than verified? Where does my genuine understanding end and my comfortable certainty begin? These are not questions Socrates invented. They are questions that arise naturally and without prompting in any mind that has been still long enough to notice them. What Socrates did was take them seriously enough to organize a life around them, to treat them not as problems to be solved and put aside, but as permanent companions, always present, always asking, never entirely satisfied with the last answer. The Stoics took that orientation and made it practical. They built it into a daily rhythm, a morning intention and an evening review, a continuous thread of honest self-examination running through the ordinary hours. Marcus Aurelius kept that rhythm in a tent on a military frontier, writing to himself in a language he knew and trusted, refusing the comfort of flattering himself, refusing equally the comfort of excessive self-reproach, simply trying to see. The medieval apophatic theologians took a structurally similar posture into the most demanding territory their tradition offered, the attempt to say something honest about the nature of the divine, and found that the most honest thing they could do was to keep removing inadequate certainties until what remained was a silence that knew itself. Not emptiness, not the failure of description, a silence with a specific quality, the quality of having arrived somewhere real by the honest removal of everything that was not quite real enough. Kierkegaard kept the orientation in a form suited to his own century and its specific failures of honesty, the philosophical systems that promised to have encompassed everything, the religion that had become comfortable, the age that mistook talking about truth for genuinely encountering it. He kept it by refusing to talk at people directly, by building in, through the architecture of his writing, the gap that each reader would have to cross alone. Foucault kept it in the form of a long historical inquiry into how power shapes what can be said and who is permitted to say it. And in his last act as a working philosopher, he brought that inquiry home to its source, to the man in the agora who had said what he found and lived in the consequences of saying it. All of these are different. They are not a continuous tradition with a single doctrine. The Stoics and the apophatic theologians disagreed about most things that mattered theologically. Kierkegaard and Foucault would have had very different conversations about the self. Pierre Hadot's patient, sympathetic reading of the ancients is not Foucault's rigorous, politically alert reading. These are different minds, different centuries, different questions, different answers. What they share is not a doctrine but a posture. Hands open, the last confident claim set down, the genuine acknowledgement arrived at through effort rather than performed as modesty, that what one knows is a small and specific region inside a much larger territory, and that the territory does not diminish in interest or importance because it exceeds one's knowledge of it. That posture is old. It was old when Zeno of Citium was describing it to students in Athens. It is available tonight in a dark room, in a body that is tired, in a mind that has been asking things all day and is ready, perhaps, to ask them more quietly. The breath is still moving. It has been moving since before any of tonight's thinking began. It will continue moving while the thinking slows and the questions lose their urgency and the particular concerns of the particular day begin to recede into the larger, quieter background where they always already were. There is something in the breath that is not a thought, not a conclusion, not an argument to be continued or a question to be answered, something simply present, simply continuing, asking nothing, requiring nothing, already here before the first lamp was lit in any of these centuries. Marcus Aurelius set down his pen, and the lamp burned lower. Eckhart finished the page, and the night continued outside the Dominican cell, unchanged and unhurried. Kierkegaard sealed the manuscript, and the city of Copenhagen went on, indifferent to what had been written in it. Foucault closed his notebooks, and the long tradition he had been reading continued past him in every direction, already moving toward readers he would never know, carrying what he had noticed into conversations he would not be part of. The inquiry continues. It does not need any single person's participation to continue. It has been going this long on its own momentum, not converging, not approaching a final statement, just turning the questions over with the patience of something that has all the time it needs. The questions about what one genuinely knows and how one genuinely lives, these are not questions that become less interesting when the lights go out. They become, perhaps, more quietly available, more willing to settle into the chest and breathe there, unheld, undemanding, simply present. What Socrates knew, in the end, was this: not that the questions had answers he had missed, not that someone wiser was somewhere waiting with the resolutions, but that the honest sitting inside the questions was itself a form of knowing, a specific, verifiable, second-order knowledge of exactly where one stood and how much of the surrounding territory remained unknown. That kind of knowing is quiet. It does not announce itself. It does not feel like certainty, because it is not certainty. It feels like a particular quality of attention that is very close to stillness. A question can rest. It does not always need to be pressed. It has been here for 25 centuries, and it will be here in the morning, patient and undiminished, ready whenever the mind is ready to return to it.